On the last episode of Mother's Basement, Geoff Thew declared the golden age of anime to be right the f*** now. However, while he was working on that video, one thing did keep bothering him. Well, two things, actually. I hate talking about myself in the third person. And the second thing is, of course, those fucking things. You know, there's a guy in the hero's party, he gets banished for how his inconveniently huge keeps tripping him up in fights. Right after leaving, he discovers he can blast ropes that take the head off a dragon at 50 paces. 3 to 7 gorgeous women start riding around everywhere on his dick. And either by design or by accident, he ends up trapping his former companions in the salty, hot glue of revenge before the story's through. That sort of thing. Though, the sort of thing that I just described, you know, the one with the thing, would probably be more fun than most of the actual fucking things that get made these days. There's a lot of problems to talk about regarding this oddly specific subgenre, not the least of which being how Columbine-y the whole vibe can get, but the biggest problem for my money is how video gamey the vibe tends to be as well. Which, just so we're clear, Mr. Fox News, has nothing to do with the Columbine-iness of it all. Those are two separate issues. Far more so than even your average isekai, where it is still very much a problem. These fucking things are absolutely lousy with RPG elements in their world building that is, for the most part, pretty lousy too. It's not impossible to build a believable lived-in world on video game logic, but it sure is a whole lot easier to just not do that. And the problem isn't limited to stat screens. It's all the blatantly artificial video gamey tropes that come part and parcel with them, any one of which can rip you right out of an anime's world if you think about it for even a moment longer than the writer obviously did. Now, is the ubiquity of these fucking things, and isekai in the same vein, enough to make me rethink calling this a golden age? Absolutely not. There is so much good fantasy on right now with none of this gamer nonsense in it. But as a gamer who does love him some nonsense, it pains me to see just how bad most of this stuff gets. Which is why today I want to do my part to fix the problem by exploring exactly what these anime are doing wrong and how some better stories do it right. And one of the positive examples I'll be using throughout the video also happens to be one of the most exciting sponsors I have ever worked with, Chrysalis by Rhino Z. If you haven't heard me gush about it before, Chrysalis is one of my personal all-time favorite lit RPG web novels, which follows this kid named Anthony who gets reincarnated as a monster ant in this dungeon the size of a planet and slowly builds his humble colony up into a utopian global empire where every citizen gets 8 hours of sleep a night or else. The books are just a delight to read and especially listen to, carried by rock-solid action writing, sardonic Aussie wit, and more beautifully tortured ant puns than you can shake an antenna at. All of which are further enhanced by the unrivaled audiobook performances of Sound Booth Theater, who also offer IMO the best way to get into the series through their phenomenally generous box set, which gives you the first 3 audiobooks. That's 55 hours of listening for just 1 Audible credit. As somebody who is addicted to audiobooks, it's like the best value I have ever found in the app. With the hotly anticipated latest book, Ant-Dustrial Revolution, due out on Kindle July 15th, there has never been a better time to get into Chrysalis, and I was recommending this shit months before they paid me to do it, so you know I mean that. And having said that, my sponsorship obligation is now technically out of the way, so you also know that every time I reference it from now on is purely for the love of the game. And, of course, for the colony! To understand why so many modern fantasy anime are like this, you first need to understand why JRPGs are like that, which all comes back to 1981 and the releases of Ultima and Wizardry, the most influential PC RPGs of all time, especially in Japan. That might come as a surprise, since neither series saw an official release there until 1985, after homegrown games like Lizard, Mugen no Shinzo, Tower War of Druaga, Hydlide, and Dragon Slayer had already taken root, and right before Dragon Quest would turn console RPGs into a full-blown phenomenon, but none of those games would exist in the first place if Japanese computer nerds like Yuji Horii hadn't fallen in love with import copies of Ultima and Wizardry earlier in the decade. Everything about Japan's divergent branch of the genre stems from that point. In the West, the fundamental ethos of CRPGs has always been emulate the tabletop experience with deeper character customization and eventually more role-playing options. But the Japanese never had that experience to begin with, not until TSR tried and mostly failed to bring D&D to their shores in the mid-80s when the JRPG boom was already underway. So in Japan, the ethos for designing RPGs has always been build a better Wizardry and or Ultima, which led them to more console-friendly, video game-centric innovations like action RPGs and linear cinematic narratives told through complex in-engine cutscenes much sooner than Western devs who were busy going all in on more text-heavy, player-driven stories. But Wizardry and Ultima didn't just give Japan its first taste of role-playing, they were also foundational to its entire fantasy fandom. Of course, Japan had produced plenty of fantastical films and shows in the preceding decades, inspired by various mythologies and fairy tales from around the world, but as far as that medieval European capital F style of fantasy went, Lord of the Rings was translated in the 70s around the same time as Earthsea and some other influential Western epics, which did go on to inspire some important Japanese literature, most notably 1979's Gwyn Saga, a legendary light novel series that is still running today at 150 volumes and counting. But all these books were a niche within a niche at a time when genre fiction was almost entirely synonymous with science fiction to the Japanese. Aside from a few exceptions that emerged around the same time and out of the same nerdy zeitgeist as the first wave of JRPGs, swords and sorcery stuff only gained the cultural clout needed to justify, for example, making a whole mess of anime out of it after the gaming boom began, with some of the earliest hits being adaptations of Dragon Quest, Dragon Slayer, and Wizardry. While the West sees stat screens and other gaming conventions as an offshoot of the foundational works of fantasy, in Japan, games are the foundation. So when, for example, the Adventurers Inn and Gilgamesh's Tavern from Wizardry 1 were amalgamated into Patty's Party Planning Place in Dragon Quest III, and the idea was then standardized as the Adventurers Guild by other games in need of party recruiting and questing hubs, it was only natural for fantasy books and anime to adopt the concept as well, often with very little thought put toward how such a thing might actually, work outside of a video game. Now, guilds in general obviously had a place in the medieval societies that fantasy strives to emulate, but the logic that justified their existence doesn't necessarily apply to adventuring, and we know that because there were no guilds for the real-world equivalents of adventurers. In wartime, mercenary companies had very little reason to form regulatory bodies with other mercenaries they were probably going to be trying to kill next week. Plus, they already had a pretty standardized apprenticeship program of here's a spear, try not to die, and in peacetime, most of them were too busy being bandits to build bureaucracies. Of course, having loads of monsters to hunt instead of killing people could potentially change that calculus, but historically speaking, hunting was the near exclusive privilege of the nobility, in part because wild game is full of valuable resources, and in part because the hunts themselves made great murder practice for knights, two factors that are going to be even more applicable if we're talking about magical monsters rather than deer or foxes. None of that's to say that fantasy worlds have to be 100% historically accurate. That wouldn't be very fantastic, but historical precedent is vital to crafting even the most imaginative of worlds, because history is the best model that we have for how civilizations tend to behave. And the mark of a great world builder is how well they can justify deviations from that model with good answers to tough questions. So, what purpose does an Adventurers Guild serve? Not to gamers, but society. What could possibly make a state want to let essentially an independent freelance militia operate within its borders? Why would the army not be dealing with monster-related problems and reaping the associated rewards? What effect does ceding those resources and that authority to private individuals have on politics or the economy? On that note, who's even paying for all these quests in the first place? And what do they or the adventurers get out of running their monster part trades, surveying contracts, bounties, and such through these middleman organizations instead of just working with each other directly? Far too many gamer fantasies just completely ignore all that. The Adventurers Guild exists because the protagonist really needs an instant support network after getting isekai'd, or some governing body to manage the employment contract with the party that just banished him, and that's it. It's there because the story needs it there, and once it's there, it is likely to warp that entire story and the entire story's world around itself, because these guilds are just such darn useful writing tools. Can't figure out how to get your hero where they need to be for the next arc? Put it on the quest board. Need to create a sense of power progression? Give them a rank up. Need a place for them to meet a new ally or rival? Hey, the guild tavern's right there. In that way, this place that has no place within the world becomes our hero's primary point of contact with the entire civilized side of it, filtering every bit of the setting that the writer did bother fleshing out through this physical embodiment of a video game menu and giving it the same artificial aftertaste. And this isn't just detrimental to immersion, it also hamstrings storytelling, as every major player in the fantasy world is now forced to play around this blatantly video gamey, often politically inert plot device. It becomes a spanner in the gears of organic, character-driven social conflict that good world building is supposed to create, and all but forces the writer to fall back on cliched formula. Of course, it's not impossible to tell a good story around a guild. Mushoku Tensei is absolutely peak, but the guild is mostly a means to other ends there, providing funds for the actual adventures. The only part of the story that's really driven by just taking random quests off the job board is the arc where Rudy is profoundly depressed, which I think maybe says something about the emotional texture of that particular plot structure. Now, I did quite enjoy how Sentenced to be a Hero handled its Adventurers Guild, which was by basically just not having one. The organization that bears the name is really just a loosely affiliated band of thugs and killers working under a former pirate lord who went semi-legit. It's an explicitly amoral entity that causes problems from basically the moment it's introduced, and ultimately betrays humanity in a desperate grasp for wealth and power, as one would expect a bunch of mercenaries to do. If you think about it, it's kind of weird how often adventurers guilds are instrumental in saving the world. Now, I say that, but one of my favorite explorations of the trope, period, is in the Legend of Heroes Trails games, which are in no small part about the political complications of running such an organization and the ramifications of it existing at all. Smaller countries tend to love how the guild supplements their military and police, but those organizations have their own antagonistic relationship to the civilian contractors that are taking their job, separate from public opinion or how the overall government feels. There are also bigger countries where the guild has no presence at all because the leaders see them as a threat, even though they have a strict policy of not interfering in politics. The series does so much to make this inherently fake concept feel like an organic part of a living, breathing world. I also think I'm a bit more inclined to like the Bracer Guild just because they don't call it an Adventurers Guild. This is definitely a personal nitpick, but I find the idea of adventuring as a day job to be deeply philosophically underwhelming. It's not that I don't like stories about ordinary jobs in fantastical worlds. Drifting Dragons, Planetess, and Interspecies Reviewers are all among my favorites, but adventure definitionally has to be a break from routine. If someone is fighting monsters and exploring dungeons every single day for a living, they're not an adventurer, they're a gold farmer, or a delver, dungeoneer, mercenary, monster hunter, explorer, seeker, cave raider, bracer. Call them whatever you want, just call them literally anything else, please. Or better yet, do something else. If you've got a big dungeon in your story and absolutely need a guild to manage access to it, fine, but instead of making them a catch-all guild for every kind of dungeon explorer, maybe have them work with other guilds for mages, rogues, and warriors, buy equipment from the armorer and fletcher's guilds, and sell materials to merchants and alchemists. Or better yet, let those guilds post their own quests in their own guild halls and hand out their own rewards for killing monsters outside the dungeon. You're not actually making a video game. You don't need one monolithic entity to act as your quest hub, temp agency, vocational school, and power scaling leaderboard, so all those things can be in one nested menu. Instead, try spreading those duties out to a bunch of different organizations with their own different needs, strengths, weaknesses, and this is the crucial part, reasons to with each other. Maybe the merchants don't like the thieves for self-evident reasons, or the mages and alchemists are competing for influence with the nobility. Perhaps the church distrusts the Delvers Union for their proximity to that obviously demonic dungeon, or maybe some bishop is just using that rhetoric as a justification to have the paladin-affiliated warrior guild take their place as dungeon gatekeepers. The more you decentralize the power structures your world is built on, the easier it is to pit them against each other and make some interesting shit happen that doesn't have to start on the job board. In Chrysalis, there is both a semi-secret society of OP dungeon crawlers called the Abyssal Legion, and a separate guild of adventurers who are really just monster resource farmers and rarely make it past the top layers of the dungeon, but still think they're hot shit. The Legion has power and influence with the surface kingdoms, which it uses to heavily regulate the flow of resources in and out of the dungeon and try to stabilize its monster ecosystem, while the guild would very much like to usurp that power and milk the dungeon for all it's worth. All of which ends up coming to a head in some of the most fun and unpredictable moments of the early books. Danmachi does just have the one adventurers guild, but it's really just a mediating force between all of the different familias and the gods that lead them, who of course have their own rivalries and relationships with each other, and the adventurers under them have similar relationships, and it just creates a very messy situation where organic conflicts can naturally arise. Speaking of dungeons though, how to do them right is really a subject that deserves its own full video essay, but if you'll permit me just one brief comment on the matter, please stop putting fucking floor bosses in them unless your anime or book is actually set in a video game. You can have all the big cool monsters you want gating the hero's progression to the next floor, just don't call them bosses, and especially don't have them infinitely respawn so that every party trying to clear the dungeon has to fight all the exact same big cool monsters as all the other parties in the exact same order. That shit feels so boring, low stakes, and video gamey. Sword Art Online didn't even do it. Look, I'm not saying your dungeons have to be ultra realistic and devoid of game logic. The idea of a self-sustaining underground magical ecosystem is one of my favorite things about Dungeon Meshi, Made in Abyss, and Chrysalis for that matter. But if you just want to have a big evil magic hole in the ground full of monsters, puzzles, and maybe some lore, that's cool. I like those. All I'm saying is, if you're gonna make me spend a whole episode watching a guy kill a big cool monster, it should stay fucking dead. Jack of all trades, stakes of none. Boom, got him. I sat through like 8 more episodes of that show as research for this video, and I feel like I watched literally nothing. It's solo leveling minus the hype and aura. It honestly put in perspective how little of a problem stat screens and skill points really are in the grand scheme of immersion-shattering video game nonsense. Even without any of those things, it feels more like watching a bad Let's Play gameplay than almost any other anime, and like half the dialogue in the game they're playing is tutorials. That said, putting a video game HUD in your anime is just about the most glaringly fake thing you can do to a non-VR MMO world, and it's a big pet peeve for a lot of fantasy enthusiasts. It even bothered me back in the day when these sorts of things first started coming into vogue, except in Overlord and Slime, because those anime are, actually good. I kind of just got used to it there very quickly, in fact, as is the case with any good anime that does such things. And while I do really like how, say, Danmachi makes its stat readouts a diegetic part of its world, I don't even think that's strictly necessary if you want to build an immersive fantasy setting around RPG systems like that. Ultimately, I've reached the conclusion that game UI is just another kind of signifier that tells the viewer, okay, this show's gonna be like this other show you're familiar with, in the same way as seeing a glowing aura around a muscled up martial artist, or a mage spewing particle effects out of her staff, or a dude cutting a boulder in half with a sword. It's just one of many types of magical aesthetic that some people with, and if you use it, you just have to accept you're gonna lose all the people who don't. Most of those people do still complain about Danmachi after all, even though it puts so much extra work into justifying the numbers on a lore level. Now, the numbers can suck all the tension and strategy out of fights by objectively confirming that Protag-kun is in fact stronger than the guy he's fighting and doesn't have to worry about anything, but that's just as true of power levels in shonen. By the same token, choosing skills and spells from a drop-down menu does kinda demystify your fantasy world, but not significantly more than any other kind of hard magic system does once the rules are fully explained. It just has that effect quicker because anyone who's played a video game before has a head start on understanding those rules, which also means they have a head start on getting to the fun theory crafting, power scaling stage of enjoying those rules. So it is definitely a trade-off on your fantasy world's overall level of immersion, but it has some serious upsides. Part of the reason that gamer isekai, those fucking things, and lit RPGs are so addictive and share so many fans between each other is because so much knowledge is transferable from series to series. As soon as you finish one, you can jump right into another and get more of what you were enjoying on at least a basic level. Problems only really arise when a story fails to move past that basic level and just gives you yet another guy who's really strong and fast and good at everything because his numbers are so big. That's all fine and dandy for baby's first lit RPG, but as soon as you get a taste for the harder stuff, it loses its appeal. The best gamer fiction uses that shared knowledge pool as a jumping off point for dreaming up hyper-specific builds and weird, broken, synergistic skill sets that could never exist in a real game because it needs to be balanced, and it would be too hard for new players to understand. In shonen power system terms, it lets you jump right into coming up with part 5 and 6 level stand concepts without having to lay the groundwork of parts 3 and 4 first. And those systems succeed or fail by a lot of the same metrics as a shonen power system. So long as the skill sets or spell lists or what have you are tailored to reflect the main character's personalities and their foes challenge them to use their powers in interesting and creative ways that the viewer or reader is able to follow and anticipate by paying attention, they're probably gonna have a fun time, and that's all you really need. You can, of course, go further with it in the same way that shonen like Hunter x Hunter or Jujutsu Kaisen can integrate their power systems much more deeply into their settings and themes. So I'm a Spider, So What has a whole religion that worships the skill system, which is a fun, logical extrapolation of what might happen if everyone in the world had a magic voice in their head that gave them magic powers. Chrysalis takes the idea several steps further with multiple dungeon-worshipping sects and cults split by vehement, dogmatic disagreements on optimal build strategies and the ethics of EXP farming. But all of that is just meat. So long as the gravy's tasty, folks will eat your gamer slop right up. For the tastiest possible gravy though, it is best to add a little bit of visual spice. Aside from making it play boring, I think the worst thing you can possibly do to your fake game is make it look boring. And holy shit, do a whole lot of gamer fantasy anime ever look like Excel spreadsheets and default RPG Maker templates. Just a teensy bit of UI design in your menus can go a long way, and you can go a whole lot further with that design because, of course, nobody actually has to interact with them. I think my all-time least defensible nitpick of Sword Art Online has gotta be saying that the menus should have been thought-controlled. Nah, those drop-down touch interfaces are absolutely fire. It is never not fun watching Kirito flick through a menu, which is more than I can say for watching Kirito fight. In many cases, game UI also comes part and parcel with flavor text and system voices, which can do just as much, if not more so, to kill the fun if they read/sound boring. Far too many anime, web, and light novel writers treat those aspects as an excuse to fill some time with dry, repetitive, low-effort technical descriptions when they should be using them as an opportunity to inject some extra flavor and personality into their worlds. I don't think it's controversial to call the AI from Dungeon Crawler Carl the definitive example of how to make the system's voice a compelling character in its own right. Its sadistic game show host personality and not at all disguised fetishes imbue every item and skill description with delightfully dark humor from the word go, and the gradual unraveling of its psyche is one of the series' most compelling subplots. It makes every new item and skill we discover feel as rewarding for the reader as it does to the characters, and that being my intro into the genre, did kind of set me up for disappointment with almost every other lit RPG audiobook I've tried, but thankfully, Chrysalis wasn't one of them, and that was one of the first things that really sucked me into it. It makes it clear very early on that the system voice, Gandalf, is a dude with his own agenda that may or may not line up with Anthony's, and while it doesn't quite have that same laugh-out-loud factor as the system AI, it is still very rewarding every time Anthony unlocks one of the full monster profiles with design notes from Gandalf that reveal more about his plans and personalities. And the full-on conversations he gets to have with Gandalf whenever he evolves are a brilliant way of tying milestones in Anthony's power progression to some of the story's most interesting lore reveals. Low-key, one of my favorite things about this season's The Strongest Job is Apparently Not a Hero or a Sage but an Appraiser provisional is how it handles Protag's support voice, Sapo-chan, who gradually evolves from a neutral exposition dispenser into a proper character over the early episodes. I also really like how it mixes things up by having the gods speak directly into his brain, a conceit the show frequently mines for comedy gold. You don't have to go the funny route with this, though. You can also make it a little scary, like roll over and die, or put some Dark Soulsy lore tidbits and mystery breadcrumbs in your descriptions. I just need some reason to care. If you can't make your system voice at least as entertaining as a Pokédex, your story's probably better off without it, in much the same way that it's almost certainly better off without an Adventurer's Guild. At the end of the day, though, even that is a matter of how you use it. Game elements are narrative tools, just like any other trope, that serve to streamline some aspects of storytelling while restricting others. The key is understanding their utility and limitations and making them work for the story you want to tell instead of against it. If you are a storyteller, then I hope this video helps you do exactly that. And if you're just a gamer slop enthusiast, I hope it makes you better able to identify the really good shit when you see it. I'm Geoff Thew, the system voice of anime watching, signing out from the Sitting on My Ass Guild.